We just appeal to this idea of greater expertise, plonk it there, and say, there's the expert, this is the amateur, don't want to have anything to do with the amateur. Yes. When things got desperate, you actually need to try to think through what can be done most safely by non-experts.
Sometimes people who we would not think of as being the real experts coming in and really being able to make major contributions.
Welcome to another edition of Paying Attention with me, Nicholas Gruen, and my trusty cup of green tea, and my friend Peyton Bowman. Today we're going to speak about amateurism and expertise. So with that, over to you, Peyton.
So what are amateurs and what are experts in your view?
Good question. I hate that. I really don't like the term expertise. I'm often referred to as an economic expert if I'm interviewed on the radio. And what I don't like about it is that this word expertise somehow it somehow absolves the non-experts from thinking about things. It often absolves the experts from thinking through something. And I think, well, we might get onto this. I think that happened with COVID a lot, that experts had rules of thumb that they pursued rather than thought through problems. So for me, I've got a bit of a concern about this word expert because if it stops us thinking about problems and trying to solve them on their merits, and I suppose, but anyway, expert means someone who knows a lot about something, and an amateur is someone who knows a bit about a thing, but often, one hopes, a good amateur will be an amateur who who has a bit of distance from the problem and tries to look at it in different ways and is a healthy part of any kind of ecosystem for thinking about difficult subjects.
Well, how do we know the difference between them? Certainly there are a lot of examples of people on TV who claim to be doctor this or that, and sometimes they're experts in certain things, but not everything. How can we tell them apart?
Well, I think the answer is we can't for sure, but the way we've tried to is we've given them little pieces of paper, and we've said, you're now an expert, but you weren't an expert for the 3 years and 9 months that you studied economics, but now you've studied for 4 years. You're now an expert, and you've got an honours degree in economics, and you're now an expert, and people should defer to you about economics. For instance, the most famous economist of the 20th century, I would say the most useful economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, was referred to by one writer I know, and with great respect, as a dilettante. John Maynard Keynes knew a great deal about a great many things, and he mobilized many of those things into his analysis. So that is ideal. The ideal is to be able to synthesize deep and focused knowledge with wider knowledge, and in a way, that should be the aspiration of an amateur and an expert. How much it is, who knows? I should add that there are areas of technical importance, weather forecasting, nuclear physics, mathematics, and so on, and it's pretty obvious that the role of an amateur is a different and more subservient role most of the time there. But again, not absolutely always.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you wouldn't want somebody without having spent, I don't know, a certain minimum amount of time studying nuclear physics, running the nuclear power plant near your house, I would imagine. But
Well, yeah. Well, you want the process to
Yeah.
have integrity, which is a somewhat different thing. I mean, for instance, when it comes to medicine, various grades of experts exploit their position. So, for instance, I don't know about what happens in other countries. It certainly happens there too. In Australia, there's lots of contestation about whether a nurse can
Mm,
prescribe an antibiotic, for instance,
mm,
as opposed to a doctor. The doctors' lobby groups say they nurse couldn't possibly do that because they're
mm,
not expert enough. Well, you could build a system in which, for standard respiratory diseases, the nurses could probably get trained to actually, and you could build a supportive evidence based system around their prescribing that would make them better than what we do at the moment. And there would be some oversight from more senior people. But we don't do any of that. We just appeal to this idea of greater expertise, plonk it there, and say, there's the expert, this is the amateur. Don't want to have anything to do with the amateur. That's
yeah.
not a very good
Well, that was
situation.
certainly a situation here in Japan when they were distributing COVID vaccines. So there was it seemed obvious to me that you have these small police stations on every corner here in Japan. They could have just trained the police officers to give people a shot, right? And it
Exactly.
would have been so easy to get that out.
Yeah.
But there were all these rules about
Yeah.
letting a
You
doctor
could train,
do something.
imagine, yeah, I'm not sort of particularly advocating this, rather using it as a thought experiment. But, you know, kids in schools would get a kick out of being taught to
Yeah,
do injections, not to inflict pain, and some of them would
yeah,
learn to be very good at it. It's something you can do, and likewise, we were. And we're now in Australia, we've got a big rise in COVID cases.
yeah.
Nurses are thin on the ground. So what do we do when nurses are all at home with COVID? Got to do something. So I've actually developed a program for like a
Mm,
military reserve, a
mm,
nursing reserve, and firstly, you would take retired nurses and keep them trained up so they could replace nurses. But when things got desperate, you actually need to try to think through what can be done most safely by
mm.
non-experts. Well, we just don't.
Yeah,
We just don't think about those things, and our professional
yeah,
associations won't let us, which is not good.
yeah. Well, I think that's a really. I mean, that's an interesting case in which you have people kind of circling their wagons and trying to defend their potentially defend their source of employment or something along these lines. But I mean, I think that there are other
Yeah.
areas where we might see, especially in areas. I think you had some experience working in kind of related to computer science of how sometimes people who we would not think of as being the real experts coming in and really being able to make major contributions.
Yeah, so I chaired this I was the first chairman of a company called Kaggle, which is now owned by Google or Alphabet. Um, and what it does is it hosts data science competitions. The most famous data science competition was the Netflix competition. Early on in Netflix's existence, it offered $1 million for anyone who could improve the algorithm, how the suggestion algorithm on Netflix. So the task was you saw all the movies that this person watched. You may also have got their ratings, and then you have to suggest other ones and the success is measured by how many you can imagine what it's guessed how it's estimated. It's estimated by how much you can get them to click on and buy successive
Hmm.
movies. So that's a technical question. That's a technical task. And so what they did is so the way you do this is you have training data and test data. The training data is all of the suggestions that have been made and their success, along with the data about the customer. And then test data is a whole bunch of new customers that you don't know anything about, but you know their data. And then you have to build an algorithm that makes suggestions for them. And they hide the answer from you. And they compare. And so so let's say you've got 100,000 you've got 100,000 customer situations where you can train your algorithm to get the right answer, and 100,000 which are the same kind of situation, but you don't have the answer. Netflix has the answer, and then it can compare all the different people and their algorithms, and it will pick the best algorithm. This is the sort of thing. So this capacity to make predictions is fundamental to a bank making a loan, because it wants to know from the data it's got on you how likely you are to default. It can be incredibly important, for an airline to schedule trips, to know how likely it is to be delayed, and so on and so forth. So it's a tremendously important skill. Kaggle built the capacity for anyone to, and you can now continue to use it, for anyone to have a data science competition built around that. And so what was so interesting about this was that we started to be able to see empirically who was a really good data scientist. And here's the upshot. Here's the big message. The best data science, no professor of statistics won a data science competition. Not one. Nobody beyond their 40s won a data science competition. A lot of PhD students won data science competitions. A lot of freshly minted PhDs won data science competitions, usually in positions called postdocs at university. And then there were quite a few cases where people with no formal qualifications at all were the best in the world at building certain kinds of models.
Oh.
So this was an incredibly powerful thing. Sorry,
I'm kind of interested to hear your speculations on why this was. I mean, of course, you would expect the professors to at least win a couple of these, right?
Yeah, well, remember, this is really outperformance. This is the best in the world. So a lot of the professors would have been okay, but it's like a performance sport. It doesn't mean that you couldn't get it at 50. But I mean, another fact I'm aware of is that if you're a pure mathematician, there's a famous autobiography by a guy called G.E. Hardy, I think is his name, or maybe it's G.H. Hardy, one or the other. And it's called A Mathematician's Apology. And it's about the fact that he's now over 50 and he knows that he will never do great mathematics
I remember
ever
reading
again.
that. And also poetry, he said. Only like young people could write poems or something like that.
That's right. Yeah. And it would have been better for him if he'd been Tolstoy, and you kind of get better and better as a novelist until you hit about 70 or so. Anyway, so he just was miserable. He used to watch the cricket and think that there wasn't much to his life. So that I think we're probably observing something there as well. But one of the things that this did was that you now had strong evidence of who was good and actually doing the job, rather than who had sucked up to the teacher, done all the tests and so on. There's a huge amount of, at universities, at schools, there's just a huge amount of going through the motions. And I'm talking about setting exams and all of these kinds of things. It's a hard task to test real creativity and rigor and to do it together. And they don't do it very well. And so this was a different way, a much more powerful way to really, to use a term we've used before, to really ground truth. this question of whether someone's good at a very specific thing. And of course, it also it sort of liberated data scientists because one of the people involved in this said, sick of these people being stuck somewhere under the stairwell and occasionally wheeled out by the powerful people to, here's a boffin we've got and he's got some numbers and isn't he cute? These people, it was finally recognizing this fact that this is really the secret sauce. This is really important for the company, and this is the person who we need to listen to, not the managing director, not some person, someone from the great and the good, some self-promoting, or just someone with an instinct for getting ahead in a hierarchy.
Yeah, so in terms of this example of Kaggle, though, I mean, I would think that, and I think I know what you're going to say. Do you think we should just have some sort of global competition for everything now, that the best way to evaluate people, or was there something kind of special about this particular competition that was similar maybe?
Yeah, I think we got going in Kaggle maybe 5-10 years after prediction markets became a huge craze. Everyone was saying prediction markets were going to sort of solve everything. And that a prediction market is a market like, well, we're all familiar with them now. What are the chances of Donald Trump being the next president of the United States as well as the last president of the United States? And I think anything that can be satisfactorily sorted out using that method should be. That doesn't tell you how best to train people, but obviously competing in such competitions is an important discipline and something I'm very confident should be a major part of training. But that's really not, there isn't a way, and lots of boosters for these sorts of methods keep trying to kid themselves that there is a way. There isn't a way to do this, to train or to test who can provide the best policy advice, who is the best person to work out what to do with your HR function. So it's a very boutique area. And it's not even the way, it's very hard to, you can't even do this in pure mathematics because pure mathematics is a creative discipline. This is perfectly adapted to a highly technical thing which can be turned into a competition without loss of fidelity, I suppose. And that's a relatively small set where it can be used. It should be used. And I think it also provides us with quite shocking ground truthing about how inefficient, ineffective our educational institutions are. But it doesn't enable us to replace them in most cases.
Well, then if we're not going to just replace them with some competition, how should we be training experts?
Well, we train them. I mean, I think the great thing here is that we train people in technique, and we don't train people in what a favourite philosophical critic or philosopher of mine, Mary Midgley, called philosophical plumbing. We don't train them in the way in which the ideas they're using relate to each other. I remember as a student of economics, you do a subject called Maths for Economists, and I had done I'm not a mathematician. I didn't go that far, but I was good at maths without being brilliant at maths at high school. And in first year uni, I aced a pure mathematics course, and it was a wonderful course. And we derived from the 13 real number axioms all of the mathematics we'd learnt in the previous 12 years. I was just completely thrilled by that. Now I've forgotten the point that I was making. but so then the point I was making is when I then so it's not that I'm not good at I'm not okay at this stuff, and then when I do maths for economists, I really can't understand it because they just toss these techniques at you, and they say just do a Hessian matrix here and a this here and a that there, and I can't do that without having some idea of why. I just find it very hard to learn without connecting up the why, and that's I think I'm almost pathological in that regard, and I've sort of made myself that way. But most students learn stuff much better if they understand the motivations of what they're doing, and we don't teach that. We conspicuously don't teach it. We don't assess it. We don't publish it. What we do is you can smuggle it into a valedictory speech as an elder statesman. That's about it. You won't get if you're doing economics and you want to be published in the most important journals. It was a famous article by Friedrich Hayek in 1945, which involves a powerful rethinking of the idea of information in economics. You couldn't publish that today. And that's a piece of philosophical plumbing, if you like. It's about the way we use ideas. And so that's how we should train experts. We're so far from training experts like that, or so far from training professionals like that, it's really not funny.
So would you imagine, let's say, experts having a kind of, I don't know, value statement, or not value statement in the kind of value statement I know you don't like, but
you're trying to trigger me.
I'm not trying to trigger you, but some sense in which, okay, I can look at this guy and I see, okay, here are the basic premises that this person uses to understand economics. Or, I mean, I know it couldn't be made that simple, but
no, I'm not. No, I'm not, because I don't think. I'm not a monist. I don't think that there's this completely uniform framework and this you just go and get a person. I think that thinking, certainly about economics, and I think of most things, is about hunting around for good ways to set the problem up for yourself, and so to teach that. It's not about a values. I mean, you might have a values. I mean, there's no problem with the value statement because everyone says these things anyway. That's one of the problems with value statements. But you do, there's lots of values that say we value different ways of looking at things. You give people experience in observing for themselves the power of a different perspective. You give them the experience of debating between different perspectives. One of the things that I'm strongly antagonistic towards is the idea, especially strong in economics and in lots of other disciplines, philosophy's one, that vigorous competitive discussion is a good thing. I think it's mostly a bad thing. Of course, good discussion is always hard, but it's a bad thing because the most valuable thing about a discussion is not this sort of trying to technically shake out the weaknesses in your opponent's position, but to realize this is this great idea that Socrates had, that a dialogue might be about discovering between two people who are disagreeing, not that one's right and one's wrong, but that in fact they both agree. But they're trying to find and they're going in search of how they agree, or they're at least just going in search of really understanding why a person thinks this way. And my own experience is that I found that immensely valuable. I learnt it in history, which I was speaking to you about earlier. I learnt it when in history, as a third-year student, having basically known nothing about the Florentine Renaissance, we were asked to write an essay on two scholars, one who was at the end of his life and had written a blockbuster book. His name was Hans Baron. Another scholar was called Gerald Siegel. I think I've got those names right. And he was the sort of new broom, and he basically thought Hans Baron had it all wrong, and he wrote a thinner book explaining why and what really happened. And I thought, well, these people have each spent, between them 6 decades studying this. I don't know anything about it. How the hell am I going to have something? How am I going to know something about this? And all I did was I read the arguments, and it was clear to me that one of them, Hans Baron, who was coming under attack, was really just trying to look for weaknesses in his opponent's argument, and he was unable to address the weaknesses in his own, basically. So this is an experience of dialogue where you've built up an entire way of looking at the world. It's going to be child's play. It's going to be shooting fish in a barrel to pick holes in the other person's argument, because there are holes in the other person's argument. And useful expertise won't be like that. Useful expertise will be saying, yeah, look, I think I can see quite a bit there and there. And it's about this process of, Socrates called it dialectic, or maybe Plato did, this process of searching for something which you share with someone, not for this alternative way where you just sort of fire people at each other and someone wins on a technical knockout, but you don't end up with any great you end up just having to trust one person rather than the other person. Us amateurs, we're not feeling very confident that we've got the right person, but we've got the best arguer.
So experts should also be able to, in some ways, succinctly state the degree of uncertainty or weakness in their own way of thinking.
Well, indeed. And there, I think the great example is weather forecasting. I think, and again, in exactly the same way that the data science story gave us a kind of crystalline illustration of the issues, which we can see because it's so crisp, we can see it so clearly. With weather forecasting, there's this marvelous thing that weather forecasters have started doing in the last 2 or 3 decades, which is that a forecast is usually in this form. There's a 60% chance of rain. Now, firstly, that forecast gives you a much better way of working out who's a good forecaster and who's a bad forecaster, because if you just said, will there be rain, if the forecast is just there will be rain or there won't be rain, then someone who says there's an 80% chance of rain and they're dead wrong because there's a 60% chance of rain, takes you a long time to find that out. Whereas if you're giving that additional piece of information, 60% versus 80%, you just line up all their forecasts and you say, did these forecasts of 60% come right about 60% of the time or not? So it gives you a lot of power to look into forecasting and see who knows who's best at this. But the other thing, the beautiful thing about this is this forecast expressed in that way is what I'll call a Socratic forecast, because it's a claim to knowledge and it's a measure of how confident you should be in that knowledge. And that's a beautiful thing. I think I'm sounding like Donald Trump here.
Yeah.
A very beautiful thing. And how much, when we have pundits on the radio talking about the economy, how much do they get pinned down in this sort of way? They are not pinned down in that sort of way. They don't express themselves in that sort of way. They're not taught in that sort of way. So they're experts in a little bubble, and their expertise is not only useless to people, but in many ways harmful, because it gives people have more confidence in these forecasts than they should. And when people have looked at how much does a very sophisticated and expert economic forecaster add to the naive forecasts of someone who knows, a sort of interested, sensible, disciplined layperson, the answer is nearly nothing. Something, but they go from, say, a thoughtful observer, a thoughtful, intelligent observer might add 10% to a naive forecast. So let me define a naive forecast for what will the economy look like in 6 months' time is you say, well, what was the average over the last 10 years? We'll go for that. So that's a super naive forecast. A sort of informed, sensible person can add about 10% of accuracy to that, and a highly expert person can add about 12% to that. And so they should go on doing what they're doing, but we really shouldn't pay too much notice, but we do.
Yeah. Well, and there's a difference too between, I think, what you might call knowledge or intelligence and then maybe wisdom. So how do we know, how can we make a line or demarcation between the things that can be known expertly and what the value judgments that are required in applying this?
Yeah. Well, I guess, yeah. So that's why we have things like parliaments and things like that. The expertise is supposed to be an input to that, not a, should we have vaccine, should we compel people to have vaccinations? Be terrible if we didn't make that decision using expertise. But ultimately, it's a decision that people have to make using what judgments that they have. I think we should be trying to train experts to be good at understanding that demarcation and to being as helpful as they can. Now, unfortunately, this, as so many other things, has been sucked into a culture war. And when you're up against just sheer disinformation, which people have been on vaccinations and things like that, then you can understand why people like Dr. Fauci say, well, this is the science and you're questioning the science. So against pure ignorance and the QAnon crowd and so on, I'm plumping for Dr. Fauci there. But the fact is that but that's a pretty terrible idea that science tells you something, and this is politicized in different ways, but on both sides. And we've had a great deal of propagandizing, of pro-science propagandizing by people who are not particularly scientific in the way they're talking about things, are not, but sort of pull science off the shelf as a set of instructions. So early on, almost every chief medical officer in the world told their population that really wearing masks would be silly. Disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful advice. The advice should have been, we don't know, it can't hurt, or we don't know, it can't hurt, but please don't go and buy one because they're needed in hospitals. But that's not what happened. And the experts just did this time and time again. A shocking thing, I think, is that we went into the pandemic and all around the world, the plan, which the more organised governments like the Australian government, the American government, the British government, they had in their back pocket a pandemic plan. And that pandemic plan had been written on the assumption that this would be a flu-like virus. And it wasn't a flu-like virus, and it was obvious that it wasn't a flu-like virus pretty early on. And there was one country where the chief medical officer establishment, the independent, supposedly expert medical people advising government, rethought their advice, and that was in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, they spent about a month saying this is not a flu. We think this is the sort of thing it is, and this is the way we should change the plan. Incredible. And you guys in America had the CDC getting in the way, stopping tests being distributed because they hadn't met certain regulatory hurdles, and just the most extraordinary things, just sort of Soviet style stupidity. There was plenty of that everywhere, and that was by so-called experts.
Well, I mean, I think one thing I've seen in these, let's say, these propaganda culture wars around these various topics is that you'll have someone who's an expert in one topic. And because he has this expertise in, let's say, an adjacent area to, I don't know, vaccinations or to health policy or something along these lines, he goes forth and he sort of presents himself as being an expert on a larger scale. I mean, are there any ways in which, I don't know, I mean, certainly it's kind of a difference where we sort of started talking about amateurs and amateurs relating to certain kinds of experts and expertise, but is there a way for the experts to police each other, or to, I mean, how can we identify the right experts for the right areas of expertise?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's hard. I've got to say, when I'm interviewed on radio, often it might be about something sort of that is adjacent to politics, and then the interviewer will invite me to tell him or her why people voted for one thing rather than another thing. Well, and I don't usually, and then it's sort of rude if I say, how would I know? Or, I mean, I try to, in my answer, to sort of play along a bit so that it's not rude to the interviewer, but then to say, well, plenty of people will have views on that, and your listeners will know as well as I do. My thinking is that. So there's this sort of pull for people to sort of leak out of their area of expertise and start pontificating about all kinds of things. And of course, we do this with celebrities as well. Celebrities feel the need to, or it's a one way to get some attention. And so Joe Rogan will be telling us about ivermectin and vaccine mandates and all this sort of stuff. On the question of experts policing other experts, this again is a very important part of science, and a philosopher I know a bit about called Michael Polanyi addressed this problem. A much more famous philosopher, Karl Popper, was preoccupied with making a distinction between what was science and what was not science, and he wasn't ultimately all that successful at being able to define exactly the distinction. Polanyi was more interested in the question, how do we make science as good as it can be? And he produced this, what he called the theory of overlapping neighborhoods. And he basically said all scientists police other scientists. This is the notion of peer review. And how does a physicist have some confidence that biology is true, is full of people trying to get to the truth and trying to engage with reality like physics is supposed to be? And his answer was that a physicist and physicists have neighborhoods of knowledge, and at the outer boundaries of their knowledge, they're capable of judging the work of people in another area and another area and another area and so on. And I think that's a pretty important thing. Again, it's a sort of my notion of ground truthing there is a very important one. And that's an area that it seems to me amateurs, I mean, in the overlapping neighborhood of the expert, the expert is not an expert, but they know enough to ground truth the others, to say, well, hang on, if that's true, isn't that true? And that's the sort of role that I think is a part and parcel of a healthy relationship between amateurs and experts, all trying to ground truth knowledge and say, yeah, I can see why you're doing that. I can see why you say that, but I think isn't there an exception here? And then if they don't get a good answer to that, they take that on board and think, all right, well, that person's pretending to have more knowledge than they really do have.
I mean, I think that I will say, I think that I'll say something in defense of amateurism in a way. I mean, I think that we are all amateurs at almost everything except for maybe one area,
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
I think there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think that it's really wonderful to engage with these different topics, and I wouldn't want an amateur, as we said earlier, running a nuclear power plant or a national health policy, but
Or drilling
but I will
UFC.
say, I think that there's something really important about in the world of education as well, about the idea of going to a topic
Yeah.
and just learning about
Yeah.
it because you love it. And this is what amateur originally means. It comes from the word to love in Latin, and it means something like a lover.
It's the same. So it's the same. Amore
That's right.
in Italian is the same root. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think, and I think amateurs do sometimes bring a fresh perspective on a subject, and they relate to it in a freer way than maybe someone whose career is dependent upon their knowledge of a subject.
Exactly.
But so given that,
Yeah.
let's say amateurs are basically good in their own way, and how should experts relate to that? Should they just, I mean, should they just look down at amateurs because they know more than the amateurs? They have spent more time studying a subject than amateurs. They've sacrificed more in a lot of cases than amateurs. Should they just dismiss their opinions and their ideas?
Yeah. Well, I think that ideally, I mean, lots of amateurs and lots of people who want to give you their opinion, it's not actually, they're not the people you want to listen to. But there's lots of knowledge about, and there is a lot in areas like mine, like economics. There are lots of ways in which, I mean, I love having conversations with people. I've actually spoken to you about this, Peyton, about having a podcast series which I call Naive Questions, and I ask people outside my field, what about this and what about that? And so I certainly like doing that. And what you're after is fresh ways of looking at things. There was a guy who gave some lectures. They're called the Boyer Lectures in Australia. You may have heard of the Reith Lectures in the UK, but they're an annual lecture series put on by our national broadcaster. And his name was Tom Fitzgerald. He gave a talk about economics, and he said that Australian economics had always made room for outside ideas that were somewhat unorthodox. Now, I'll give you an example of an idea from outside economics that was unorthodox and incredibly valuable. It's Henry George's idea that if you buy land and it goes up in value, it shouldn't really be your value to capture. It's gone up because the land has become more scarce, not because you've done anything to the land. So the increases. So he proposed, and this is at a time when income tax was quite low. He proposed that unimproved capital value of the increases in the unimproved capital value of your land. So if you build a supermarket on a block of land, you deduct all the costs, and then you get a whole lot more money back. That most of that's going to be yours to keep if you added the value. But to the extent that it's not from what value you added, but just from sitting there and becoming more and more scarce as a city builds, he argued to tax that at 100%, which of course puts the fear of God into people. And often taxing something at 100% turns out to be rather bad for incentives in various ways. But at least in theory, there's nothing you can do to get around this tax. You need the land, you buy the land, and then you give up this free gift that you got from the rest of the community. Now, he used the sort of economics you can learn in an afternoon to see this and to argue this. He was badly treated by an economist for whom I've got a high regard generally, a guy called Alfred Marshall. He was not he was sort of regarded as a bit of a crank by lots of economists, but he had a fantastically powerful insight, and a more powerful insight than a hell of a lot of economists. So great pity. Also, at around about the same time, right through the 1890s through the Depression, you had all sorts of cranks running around with all sorts of crazy and very interesting and often quite worthwhile ideas in the area of credit. You had the social credit movement, Douglas credit, all this stuff. These questions about what is money, and money is credit, and we won't go into that, and how should we manufacture it and regulate it and all these things. It was a very lively period, and we're now having to think through a lot of those things again with crypto and the fact that our central banking system is sort of falling apart in lots of ways. So there's some examples in my discipline of how welcome amateur ideas can be, but of course they then need to be clarified and thought about, and you don't just sort of, it's not a case of anything goes, but it's anything goes going in, and then more thoughtful things should come out of the process of expertise.
Yeah, that's interesting. It reminds me a little bit of idea that I read about from liberation theology, where, and this is way outside, talk about kind of an outside concept being brought into this discussion, but the idea is that inside of the Roman Catholic Church, there's this magisterium, this teaching office, which dictates all the doctrine that everybody has. But then in these South American communities, which were very, very poor, you had these people who had this special insight of actually being sort of like Jesus was. Yeah, and that poor. Jesus had a special relationship with these poor people in there. And so the idea, which I think was pretty much stamped out of the church, but was that you would have this liberation theologian who would mediate between the communities of poor people and their interpretation of scripture, and then these. I
think it's a fantastic idea, especially in that area. If you think you're Christian, then surely that's got to be attractive. Now, the Catholic Church I don't know enough about it to say too much, but the Catholic Church had a fit because, of course, they had very radical views. But goodness me, is it so radical to say, listen to these people as if they have something incredibly valuable to say to you? That doesn't say more than that. It doesn't say that you end up doing what they say, but it just strikes me as a terrible idea that if you regard yourself as a Christian, that you wouldn't do precisely what it was being argued they should do, which is to take this stuff as the lifeblood of their own religion.
But it's interesting, too, of this special office of this kind of mediator or this interpreter. And I don't know how that would be applied in this particular case.
Oh, easy. Well, I think, I mean, I don't know whether you appoint somebody, but yes, this is the sort of thing that people should do, experts should do. But, experts, the incentives on most experts are to appeal to other experts.
So, yeah. And, I mean, I think, too, in a way, we're living in an era partly because of a lot of the confusion and propaganda of our environment, where people are sometimes pretty suspicious of experts. I mean, there's certainly people who dislike people like Fauci or other experts on things like climate change, or even people who have the audacity to say that the world is round, and they doubt these experts, and they say that they're corrupted by the institutions, which are themselves these kinds of often left-wing institutions, whether it's Harvard, the New York Times, or something like this. But I mean, I think that I would say that it's also important for a real amateur to have a kind of sense of gratitude or something along these lines towards the experts. And I think this is an important part, maybe, of that contract between expert and amateur, which is, I sort of think about those people who are taking pictures of space in their backyard, and it's a little bit of more of a technical area, but
Yeah.
they're not going to
Yeah.
look at these images that we got from the James Webb and say, this is
Oh, well, it's,
terrible. I think
yeah,
we
well,
should
to
ignore these
my,
pictures. They're horrible and they're fake, and
yeah,
I don't like them. No, but they should look at these with the
yeah,
awe and
yeah,
the respect and trust, in a way, in these experts, so
yeah,
that
yeah,
that
yeah, absolutely.
their work has
Absolutely.
merited. So it's an interesting question too.
Yeah. Well, yeah, well, we should proceed with real respect for each other generally, and certainly amateurs of experts and the other way around. And also, and that's the right context in which to be genuinely usefully
Mm,
skeptical of each other as well, and to test each other out. And I'd quite like to suggest that a good note to go out on is Charlie Munger's great line that the highest form of life is a seamless web of
mm,
deserved trust. So ideally, in an ideal utopian world, an expert could trust an amateur not to pretend to know more
mm.
than they do, and vice versa, and exactly the same way around. The expert knows a bit more or a lot more, but they also have this deep understanding of how little they know and how much they rely on others to
Mm.
correct them when they're wrong.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Well, thank you very much, Nicholas.
Good. Thanks, Peyton.